In a quiet diner, an old man sat alone, trembling but proud. Moments later, a thug's hand cracked across his face, silencing the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But 1 hour later, the door swung open and the silence broke. When his son walked in with Hell's Angels, welcome to Shadows of Dignity. The sun had barely risen over Ashfield, a small town where time seemed slower than the world outside. Inside a corner diner, Earl Whitman, 80 years old, sat at his usual booth by the window. Earl wasn't just another old man. He was a veteran who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, but his eyes, blue and piercing, still held a quiet strength. Regulars knew him, nodded at him, but few really knew his story. To most, he was just the man who ordered black coffee and toast every morning. But behind those weathered lines on his face lived memories of war, of brothers lost, and sacrifices nobody in that diner would ever understand. That morning felt like any other, filled with the smell of bacon and eggs, the chatter of waitresses, and the low hum of an old jukebox, until the bell above the door rang and a different kind of energy entered. The man who walked in didn't belong in Ashfield's diner. He was younger, mid-30s, with a leather jacket draped carelessly over his shoulders and anger resting heavily in his stride. His boots hit the tile floor with sharp echoes, as though each step was a challenge. His name was Trevor Cole, though no one asked and no one dared to. He scanned the room, his smirk dripping with arrogance. Some people lowered their eyes, hoping not to catch his attention. He carried with him the kind of energy that demanded trouble. He didn't sit quietly like the rest. He slammed himself into a booth, shouted for coffee, and tapped his fist against the table impatiently. His voice was harsh, grating, the type that filled a room even when he wasn't speaking. Earl noticed him but said nothing. He had lived long enough to know storms when they were coming. But the storm was closer than anyone realized, and it was about to break right over Earl. Earl sat quietly, buttering his toast with slow, deliberate hands. Trevor kept glaring across the room as if searching for a target. The waitress, nervous but polite, tried to keep her voice steady when she brought his coffee. Trevor sneered at the cup. "Is this all you people can make?" "Mud water." His tone dripped with contempt. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to listen, though everyone's ears were burning. Earl, who had always believed in respect, even for strangers, raised his voice just enough to be heard. "Young man, no reason to talk to her that way." "She's just doing her job." The diner grew still. Trevor slowly turned his head toward Earl, his smirk twisting into something cruel. "What did you just say, old man?" Earl didn't flinch. His hands rested calmly on the table. "I said be kind." "It doesn't cost you anything." For a moment, silence held the room, and then Trevor stood. Trevor walked slowly toward Earl's booth, each step deliberate, savoring the fear rising in the diner. Earl didn't move, didn't even blink. When Trevor reached the booth, he leaned close, his voice dripping with mockery. "Kindness? What's an old fossil like you know about kindness?" Without warning, his hand lashed out. A sharp crack filled the air as Trevor's palm struck Earl's cheek. The sound silenced everything, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the jukebox, even the waitress's nervous breaths. Earl's face turned slightly with the force, but his eyes never left Trevor's. No anger, no fear, just a calm, quiet dignity. Trevor smirked, pleased with himself. "That's what kindness gets you," he spat, straightening up and looking around the diner, daring anyone to challenge him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room froze in shame and helplessness. Earl slowly dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin. His voice was soft but steady. "You don't know what battles really are, son." The diner stayed frozen in heavy silence. Trevor strutted back to his booth, proud of his display. He sipped his coffee like a man who had just claimed a throne, but the customers couldn't meet each other's eyes. Shame lingered in the air, not just for Trevor's cruelty, but for their own silence. Earl sat with his toast untouched, his hand trembling slightly now. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply sat, shoulders squared, as if holding back years of memories only he could carry. The waitress, her eyes wet, whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitman." Earl gave her the faintest smile, a smile that carried both forgiveness and sorrow. "Not your fault, dear." Trevor laughed loudly, forcing the room to stay under his grip. "See, old man knows his place." He believed the moment belonged to him. What he didn't know was that time had its own way of balancing the scales. Earl sat still, but inside memories stirred like restless ghosts. He remembered being 18, crouched in trenches far from home, mud in his boots, fear in his chest. He remembered brothers who never came back, men who had given everything for one another. And he remembered why he had survived, because someone had taught him that courage wasn't about fists or noise. It was about standing tall when the world tried to break you. Earl didn't care about the slap. His body was old and pain was no stranger. What cut deeper was the silence in the diner, the way everyone pretended nothing had happened, the way no one defended dignity. He didn't hate them. He understood. Fear is heavy. Silence is the strongest voice. Still, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the stranger who carried so much darkness in his heart. Trevor smirked across the room, thinking the war was over. But Earl knew battles often end differently than they begin. At a booth near the back, a young man in his 20s shifted uncomfortably. He wore a baseball cap pulled low, hiding his eyes. He wanted to stand, to say something, but fear chained him to his seat. He looked at Earl, ashamed, then back at Trevor, whose laughter filled the room. The waitress, trembling, poured another cup of coffee, her hands shaking so badly some spilled on the counter. She bit her lip, glancing at Earl, silently begging for forgiveness. Earl caught her eye and gave the smallest nod as if to say, "It's all right." That nod lit a spark in the young man's chest. But before he could rise, Trevor slammed his hand on the table again. "Nobody got anything to say?" "That's what I thought." His grin widened, feeding on silence. Outside, the sound of a motorcycle engine faintly echoed in the distance. No one noticed yet, but soon that sound would grow louder. And with it, everything inside the diner would change. Time slowed in that diner. Every tick of the old wall clock sounded louder, heavier, like a countdown. Earl sipped his cooling coffee, the taste bitter, but grounding. Trevor stretched out in his booth, arms spread wide like a king surveying his domain. Customers shifted nervously, eyes darting toward the door, hoping someone might walk in, someone who could stand where they could not. Earl thought of his son, Caleb. He hadn't seen him in weeks. Caleb worked long hours as a mechanic in the city. His life was rough around the edges, but filled with loyalty and grit. Earl had raised him to respect others, to fight only when he must. But he also knew Caleb carried a fire inside him, a fire that once lit could not easily be put out. Earl whispered his son's name under his breath, a prayer more than a hope. Caleb wasn't here, not yet. But outside, that faint motorcycle rumble grew closer. A storm was rolling toward the diner. Trevor, restless, stood again and looked directly at Earl. "You know what your problem is, old man? You think respect matters, but respect is weakness." His words dripped venom, his grin daring anyone to argue. Earl held his gaze, his voice steady. "Respect is the only strength that lasts." Trevor laughed, sharp and cruel. He looked around the diner, his eyes locking on the young man in the baseball cap. "What about you, kid? Want to play hero? Stand up and I'll knock you down twice as hard." The young man froze, shame washing over him, and Trevor smirked triumphantly. He turned back to Earl, towering over him. "You think you're tough? Tell me, what's toughness look like now?" "Huh?" Earl's silence was his answer. Not weakness, but defiance. Trevor leaned closer, whispering, "You've got no one left to fight for you." Just then, the roar of multiple motorcycle engines thundered outside. Trevor's smirk faltered just slightly. The clock struck noon, and the storm entered. The sound shook the glass windows, deep growling engines that made the diner vibrate. Every head turned toward the door as it swung open. The air changed instantly. Leather jackets, heavy boots, and the unmistakable presence of men who carried themselves with unshakable authority. At their center was Caleb Whitman, Earl's son, broad-shouldered with grease still under his fingernails. Caleb walked with the calm stride of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. Around him were members of the Hells Angels, their patches bold, their presence undeniable. The diner inhaled as one, the silence thick with awe and fear. Caleb's eyes found his father immediately. He saw the red mark on Earl's cheek. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists. Without a word, Caleb walked across the room, every boot step echoing like a drumbeat. Trevor leaned back, suddenly less certain. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and for the first time that morning, Trevor's grin began to fade. Caleb reached his father's booth and dropped to one knee beside him. He didn't speak at first. He just looked into Earl's eyes. Earl's calm gaze met his son's fiery one, And in that silent exchange, more was said than words could carry. Caleb's voice finally broke the silence, low and rough. "Who did this?" Earl, steady as ever, placed a hand gently on his son's arm. "It's all right, Caleb. Let it be." But Caleb's eyes lifted, finding Trevor across the diner. The Hells Angels stood behind him like shadows, their presence filling every corner. Trevor shifted in his seat, his arrogance now tinged with unease. He tried to smirk, but it wavered. Caleb stood, his voice carrying weight. "Stand up." The room tensed. The young man in the baseball cap leaned forward, holding his breath. Trevor's hand twitched nervously on the table. The silence wasn't fear anymore. It was expectation. Everyone waited for what would come next. Trevor hesitated. For the first time, he looked smaller. But pride, that dangerous fuel, pushed him to stand. He rose slowly, trying to steady his breath, trying to mask his shaking hands. Caleb didn't move closer, not yet. His voice stayed calm, almost too calm. "You think it makes you strong to hit an old man?" Trevor forced a laugh. He had it coming. Caleb's eyes darkened. "That's my father." The words struck harder than fists. The Hells Angels shifted subtly, their weight leaning forward, silent but ready. The entire diner held its breath, afraid even the clink of a coffee cup might shatter the moment. Trevor puffed his chest, trying to reclaim the swagger slipping from him. "What? You going to teach me a lesson with your gang?" Caleb shook his head slowly. "I don't need them to deal with you." The room froze. This wasn't about numbers. It was about truth. Earl's hand reached out, grasping Caleb's wrist with surprising strength. "Son," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Don't." Caleb looked down, torn between rage and respect. Earl's voice softened, yet carried the weight of years. "This isn't your fight. This is his burden, not yours." Caleb clenched his jaw, struggling against the storm inside him. The Hells Angels watched silently, bound by loyalty but respecting the father's words. Trevor saw an opening, smirking again. "That's right. Hide behind Daddy's wisdom." But Earl's eyes locked on him, sharp and unflinching. "You mistake restraint for weakness. That's your greatest blindness." Trevor's smirk faltered again. The room's energy shifted, not because of violence, but because of something far stronger: dignity. Caleb exhaled, his fists loosening, though his body still shook with unspent fire. The young man in the baseball cap swallowed hard, realizing he was witnessing not just strength but legacy, the passing of a lesson from father to son. The silence in the diner grew heavier, pressing against every wall. Trevor tried to laugh, but it rang hollow now, like a man trying to convince himself. Caleb stood firm, not moving, letting the silence weigh on Trevor's shoulders. The waitress, her hand still trembling, finally spoke, her voice cracking. "Why don't you just leave?" Trevor turned sharply, glaring at her, but the courage in her eyes stopped him. One by one, other customers lifted their gaze, no longer shrinking away. The young man in the baseball cap straightened in his seat. A couple in the corner, who had kept their heads down, nodded slowly. For the first time, Trevor wasn't facing one man or even a gang. He was facing a room filled with quiet resistance. Earl's words had taken root. Respect was rising like a tide. Trevor's arrogance cracked under the weight. His fist curled, but his confidence was gone. He was no longer in control, and he knew it. Trevor's breathing quickened. He scanned the room, desperate for the control he had felt only minutes ago. But now every pair of eyes bore into him, not with fear, but with judgment. His shoulders slumped slightly, though he tried to disguise it with another smirk. Caleb stepped forward just once, closing the distance by a single step. That step carried the weight of everything: the motorcycles outside, the Hells Angels behind him, and the bloodline of a man who had survived war. Trevor's smirk flickered. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. This doesn't mean anything," he muttered. But the words lacked power. Earl spoke again, voice calm but commanding. "It means everything. It means your fists don't rule here. Respect does." Trevor looked at Earl, truly looked, and saw not just an old man, but someone unbroken, someone stronger than he could ever be. For the first time, Trevor's eyes lowered, and that was his defeat. The diner's door seemed farther than it was, but Trevor finally moved toward it. His steps dragged, no longer sharp and commanding. The room stayed silent, watching. Each face that had once turned away now looked straight at him, unafraid. The waitress stood tall, her shoulders squared. The young man in the baseball cap removed it, revealing his eyes at last, steady and unflinching. Trevor's boots scuffed against the floor, his swagger gone. He pushed open the door, the bell above it chiming weakly. Outside, the roar of motorcycles waited, a wall of sound reminding him of what he had lost. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The diner exhaled as one, the heavy air releasing at last. Earl sipped his cold coffee, finally setting the cup down. Caleb sat across from him, his fists still tense, but his eyes softening as he looked at his father. Respect had been defended not by violence, but by dignity, and the lesson lingered. Caleb leaned forward, his voice low, almost breaking. "I should have," Earl interrupted gently. "No, son, you did exactly what you needed to. You stood, and sometimes standing doesn't mean striking. Sometimes it means holding back." Caleb's jaw trembled. He had always believed strength meant action. But watching his father, weathered yet unbroken, he understood something deeper. The Hells Angels, men known for toughness, stood silently, their respect for Earl etched into their eyes. Even they recognized the power of restraint. Caleb nodded slowly, his chest loosening, the fire inside settling into something steadier. "I get it now," he whispered. Earl smiled faintly. "Good, because the world doesn't need more fists. It needs more hearts." The young man in the baseball cap finally rose, walked to Earl's booth and said softly, "Thank you, sir." His voice trembled, but courage lived in it. Earl nodded. Courage was contagious, and it had finally filled the room. The diner slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed, tentative at first, then warmer. The jukebox hummed again, filling the silence with soft music. Plates clattered, coffee poured, and the air felt lighter, almost sacred. The waitress placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Earl, her hand steady now. "On the house," she said with a smile. Earl thanked her, lifting it carefully, savoring the warmth. Caleb leaned back, watching his father with new eyes, not just as a parent, but as a man who carried an unshakable truth. The Hells Angels quietly filled the booths around them, their laughter low but respectful, like guardians at ease. The young man in the baseball cap sat taller now, confidence flickering in him like a new flame. The diner wasn't just a place for breakfast anymore. It had become a place where silence had been broken, where dignity had stood firm, and where a lesson had been planted in every soul present. As the afternoon sun poured through the windows, Earl turned to his son. "Caleb," he said softly, "a man's true strength isn't measured by how hard he hits. It's measured by what he protects." Caleb swallowed, the words sinking deep into him. He looked at his father, the red mark still faint on his cheek, and felt both pride and sorrow. Pride because his father had stood tall. Sorrow because the world was often cruel to men who carried such dignity. Earl reached across the table, his weathered hand gripping Caleb's firmly. "Promise me, son. When the world pushes you, don't just push back. Stand taller. That's how you'll honor me." Caleb's eyes misted, but he nodded firmly. "I promise, Dad." The jukebox played a soft tune, almost like a hymn. Outside, the motorcycles rumbled again, ready to roll. Inside, an old soldier passed down the final truth of his battles. When Earl finally stood, the diner rose with him, not out of obligation, but respect. He tipped his cap politely to the waitress, smiled at the young man in the baseball cap, and patted his son's shoulder. Together they walked to the door, the Hells Angels falling in step behind Caleb like silent guardians. As they left, sunlight spilled across the diner floor, brighter than before. The customers sat in silence again, not out of fear, but reflection. They had witnessed something rare, not fists against fists, but dignity against arrogance. Outside, Earl lifted his face to the breeze, the roar of motorcycles surrounding him like an anthem. He closed his eyes, whispering words no one else could hear. Respect always wins. Caleb looked at his father, not as a fragile old man, but as the strongest man he had ever known. The road stretched ahead, endless and alive, and together they walked into the light. In a world that often confuses power with cruelty, Earl reminded us all that true strength is found in respect,